Hey everyone, Curse Deck Builder here, making our way to 10,000 decks assisted, and here we are with Gandalf Westward Voyager, a Simic blue-green ramp deck. This is one of our donation decks of the week, and it comes from, I want to say Lambert or Lambert? Please tell me if I'm pronouncing your name right. I want to get it right. They say, "Hi, here's my deck. This is my first big mana deck. It is supposed to draw cards, ramp a lot, and play really big creatures and not much else. Gandalf is there to give incidental value as I do it. I try to include 5+ mana ramp spells so I can get truly absurd amounts of lands out in the event that Gandalf successfully copies one of them. This is straightforward enough, but it is also my first deck of this type, so I wanted someone to look over it. Do I have enough ramp, card draw, enough for too few big creatures, that kind of thing. In particular, I'm not sure if I'm taking advantage enough of Gandalf's ability, and I'm not sure how to do that outside for going for artifact enchantment creatures, and not many of them are very convincing when you have access to big green." And they say, "Finally, this is a budget deck. It's mostly to try out this playstyle and keep me occupied until Bloomburrow set comes out, and then it cuts off because there is actually a limit to how much you can send it a message when you donate a deck. I'll have to assume it was this year. But thank you so much, thank you for supporting the channel, and thank you for the ramp deck. I really do like Simic Ramp. I think it's a great place to start, whether you're new or old at the game, new or old to Commander, it is a solid way of playing it. And Gandalf is a very interesting direction to go in there. So let's get right to it. If you'd like to take a look at the deck list we're talking about today, or if you'd like to submit your own deck list to me so that I can make a video assisting your deck, please check the video description down below. So who is Gandalf Westward Voyager, and why are they our commander of Simic Ramp? He is a 5 mana, green-blue avatar wizard, 5/5. And he has one ability that says, whenever you cast a spell with mana value 5 or greater, each opponent reveals the top card of their library. If any of those cards share a card type with that spell, copy that spell, and you may choose new targets for the copy, and each opponent draws a card. Otherwise, you draw a card. A copy of a permanent spell becomes a token." Now, this is a very interesting commander because it is kind of tricky to make him work consistently, right? There's a few things we can do, and they're not good, right? We can use Fate Seal, we can use a bit of top control, but a lot of the cards that enable us to mess with the top of opponents' decks, and not all of them at the same time. There's a lot of cards that'll flip the top card of everyone, or flip the top, or shuffle the decks, or something like that. And we'd rather be able to change specific opponents' cards, because we just need one to flip. I guess we could flip all of them, but regardless, all of these cards are bad. That's the main problem, is a lot of these cards, I think almost universally, these cards are just not very good cards. Instead, I think you kind of just go for it, right? You hope for the best to use a card that will get doubled, and if you don't, you get to draw a card, which I think is a really good deal. This deck encourages you to build, as a deck builder mentioned, 5 mana or higher, which is a really interesting kind of build for the deck and gives us a lot of options. Looking at the deck itself, I think the core of it is pretty good. There's a few things outlying that I think, might need to change, but I do see this as kind of like an early draft, and there's a lot of different things we can do to improve on it. So first thing I want to talk about, as we always start with, is our lands. 38 lands is good, but when we're playing a ramp deck, we can actually go a bit higher. I would recommend somewhere 40, 42, as almost all of our ramp just pours lands onto the battlefield. I think we can get away with it, and I don't think there's any reason not to. Likewise, we are playing 31 basic lands with forests and islands. Now, I'm going to suggest some non-basics when we get to my additions, but that's kind of a lot. That's just a lot. We can play tap lands, we can play a bunch of cards that have the forest subtype, so we can take advantage of certain cards. We just have tons and tons of options, and we should be, taking advantage of them instead of playing a bunch of these basics. After that, we look at the curve. The curve generally looks good. I will note that it kind of plateaus a few times. There's only so much we can do. Obviously, 5 and higher, it's just going to be the number of our deck because we're trying to hit that kind of special number. So there's not much we can do to really cleanly change this setup, but I think is just going to look at that. 4 could be even a little more even, but 4 is even interesting to us because it is like the number that's just before the number we want to hit, so it does make sense that it's a bit lower. All right, looking at the deck itself, let's just kind of go all over the place at things that I noticed. So starting with artifacts, Lantern of Insight, and to a lesser extent over here we've Wizened Snitches. These are both cards that let us play with all of the top cards of our libraries revealed. Now, I get the idea of this is that with the information, we're going to be able to decide between, you know, casting, I don't know, Rishkar's Expertise versus casting, like, let's just say, Ubenweld Hydra, right? And I get that is important. However, I'm going to suggest that these cards are bad. These cards are just objectively very, very bad because they kind of slot very much so in win more, right? In order for these cards to be good, you need to 1, have your commander out, 2, have 5+ mana in order to cast these big spells, and 3, have one of those big spells in your hand. I guess 4 would be having a big spell in your hand that matches the top of each opponent's deck, right? Or one of them, which already I think you just kind of take the chance on. I just think this is too much for too little reward, right? You really have to work for this. All of the stars have to align just to happen, and the deck already works that way, right? You're casting out these cards and you're just hoping for the stars to align to begin with, and I think that's generally good enough. So these cards I want to cut right away. After which, looking at these, we have a lot of artifact ramp. And I think generally we don't need this much artifact ramp. One of the benefits of being in green is that a lot of our ramp just gets to be lands on the battlefield. Now, over the years, there's been a lot of, change in how certain decks play against your opponents with a bunch of lands. There's more punishing effect, or white can gain more lands this way. So I do get the idea of having some artifacts to kind of even it out, but I think the numbers are still too high. I think I'd play Soul Ring, Arcane Signet, and maybe Mind Stone, and that's it. And Mind Stone only because we can sacrifice it to draw a card. That's really, really it. The rest I think we're overdoing, and I think I'd be happier with just a few more ramp that would directly ramp onto the battlefield. Speaking of ramp, I'm going to do my ramp speech as I often do, because we have a few 1-mana creatures here. Now, the ramp speech goes a little like this. There are basically 3 types of ramp cards in green in Commander. The lowest mana ones are creatures, mana dorks, 1-mana creatures that tap for 1 mana. The middle ones are the 2 mana, Nature's Lore, Farseek, these kind of cards, which we have a bunch more that we aren't playing, I think, which is, I would suggest taking out the ramp here and putting them. But these kind of 2-mana ramp cards that will put a land directly into play. And then after that, we've got the Cultivate, Kodama's Reach, and Beyond, where you're paying 3+ mana, but you're usually guaranteeing at least 2 lands, if not 1, like Cultivate and Kodama's Reach is 1 in your hand, 1 on the field. You're guaranteeing like having 2 on the battlefield, such as looking at things like, let's see. Do we not have one that just guarantees? Interesting. Let's say Open the Way for the sake of argument, the easiest one, where we can just go X is 4, and that's going to guarantee having 4 lands into play. So, in a deck like this, generally the idea is when you have the lower mana creatures, it's because you're trying to hit 3 mana as fast as possible, and you have something to do with those creatures in the later game. If you're playing the Farseeks and Nature's Lore, you're trying to play more that middle game, get to 4 as fast as possible, and when you're playing the bigger ones like Cultivate and Kodama's Reach, you're trying to hit 5, 6, 7 mana, which is what we're playing. So I want to see a lot more of these higher mana cards, and I want to see a lot less of these 1-mana creatures. We can see that we don't have that many 3-drops, and we don't have a lot of 3-drops that I'm like falling over myself to cast. And with that in mind, I think it's going to be pretty easy to cut these 1-mana dorks, because late game, you're going to be pretty unhappy drawing these cards when, instead you could just draw Kodama's Reach style spells, which you're still happy casting late game, because it's not card draw, but it's card advantage. You are pulling more cards onto the battlefield, you're playing more, you're supporting your deck further than just playing a mana dork. So I think those cuts will be really, really easy. Looking back at sorceries, I want to point out Body of Research, where I feel it's just a little too clunky. I do think it's cute, don't get me wrong, but the green, 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 blue, blue, blue feels just kind of excessive. Now, I get in theory you're getting like a 70-70, but the fact that it doesn't have trample, it doesn't have an ETB, you know, there's a certain size in these kind of games where it just doesn't matter how big they are. It's more about them connecting. And this creature is very, very large, and it is possible to double it with Gandalf. I just don't think that's good enough. Now, I'm not going to rush to say take it out, but it is something that I think I would pay attention to as you play the deck. Rishkar's expertise and Traverse the Outlands are both dependent on having large creatures. I don't think that's too much of a problem, but I think you should keep that in mind. I'm definitely going to suggest a bunch of cards that are non-creature spells to add as like your payoffs, but just keep that in mind that like they are dependent on what you have and therefore can be a little weaker in both draw and ramp. Return of the Wild Speaker is similar to that, but I think once again, you know, you're just taking it because it's really, really good. Negate and Counterspell are interesting here as our first counter magic spells. So they're not bad, and I don't think I mind them, but I think I would rather Arcane Denial, at least to start with, and then maybe even Delay. Now, I didn't put those in my suggestions because the interaction isn't where I want to be, but I did want to note it here that, you know, you want cards like Arcane Denial, hard counters, draws you a card. And Delay is not a hard counter, but it is easier to cast than Counterspell. I like Delay, but maybe here it's not as good, so maybe not on that, but Arcane Denial for sure I think would belong here, allow you to keep going, and having one in a blue is a lot easier than blue-blue. Alright, let's look at some of our payoffs. Now, we have a few mana dorks at 3, but they all kind of do something that I don't mind. Gwenna feels a little narrow, but if we add a bunch of creatures, I think it's fine. It's just a little close. Alright, so a lot of these cards are just kind of okay. Conclave Sledge Captain. This feels kind of too cute. I do appreciate the fact that this creature gives Trample, which is something that's much better than... Where is it down here? Much better than Body of Research, but it is kind of a clunky card. It works a lot better in a +1/+1 counter deck, and so a lot of the times there's going to be situations that this just comes out as like a 7/7, and when you don't have any other creatures, and that's not going to be ideal. So that I don't like as much. Paleoth is cool. Bailiff is great. Realm Seekers I think is fantastic. I do prefer Realm Seekers to Body of Research, even though both of them are just big beaters because of the activated ability this creature has. And let's see the rest. Stonekilled Vanguard, yeah, I think that's fine. It's removal, I think that's okay. Archetype of Endurance is good. Emergent Woodworm, I think is fine. I think it's fine. I think it's a little clunky. It does come in as a 7/7, but once again, backup is a bit rough when you don't have a big +1/+1 counter kind of plan. So, Giant Ankheg, and I think there was another one down here, Stonehoof Chieftain, and yeah, so Stonehoof Chieftain and Giant Ankheg both feel really weird as like the top of our curve. I do like that this gives Trample, don't get me wrong, I do like that, but the Ward 2 seems just kind of okay. I think this at least has some utility to it, but I think... So if we had ways to like mass summon creatures, I would like this a lot more. Because the thing about Ward 2 is that generally you want it on... Like, this power gets better and better the more creatures you have, right? Because Ward 2 is just okay at this point in the game. Most people are able to pay it. But if you spread that Ward 2 enough that your opponents are kind of pressured into what they're going to remove, and for some reason they don't want to remove this first, you know, they might end up running out of mana. I don't really see it coming, see it happening, sorry. The trample is good, so this is just kind of okay in my mind. I think we can have just more, immediate effect. And likewise, Stonehoof Chieftain, I do like that it gives trample, but it's reliant on attacking. Like these cards are cool, but they are reliant on the rest of the creatures you have doing what you want them to do, and they don't get better in multiples. I will say that the ward obviously gets better, but trample and indestructible don't get better if you have multiples of these cards, so I find them a little weak at the top of our curve. And those are generally the cards I want to pick on to begin with. There's a few more here and there that I feel like we could probably improve if we wanted to, but I think the rest of them are pretty fine. Things like Resculpt also could be why can't I remember what it's called? Are turning into, what is it, rapid hybridization, and the one that turns them into apes, are 1 mana blue, destroy target creatures. Those are a little better than Resculpt, but I think they're $5 to $8, so I understand them as budget calls. When people say budgets, they don't usually say sometimes they don't say what the budget is, so I do appreciate next time, let me know exactly what the budget is, because I can definitely keep within that budget. Right now we're under $100, and I'm trying to keep up with that. Alright, let's look at some additions that I have. Alright, first things first, nice and easy, we have a large amount of blue-green lands you could be playing. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these. I just searched these up by looking up blue and green. That's not including add any color lands that we could put in, but take a look through these, find some non-basic lands and play them. 31 basics is far too much, and especially if we look down here, we've got a few. Where are they? We should have a few. Interesting. Where are my forests and interesting. What did I search here that was wrong? To have blue and green, and yet we don't have any forest islands. Weird. Let's do that right now. Forest island. So these ones I think are going to be especially helpful to you because there we go. Yeah, why weren't these here? Oh, it's because they don't actually... got you. Lesson time. These cards do not actually have this text on them. They just tap for green or blue because they are a forest or an island. They don't... This is reminder text. This is not text on the land. Just like, forests just don't have text on them. They have a symbol to remind you, but we just know forests tap for green. Regardless, looking at these, obviously not the triomes here, but we have a bunch of forest islands here that I think, maybe not tropical island, but I think are worth playing because even if they come in tapped, they're really, really good, especially Rimewood Falls and Tangled Islet, because you can ramp into them with cards that look for forests, or like Farseek that look for islands. So I think these would be the primary two I would get on a budget. And after that, start getting everything, the cheapest ones you can get of all the non-basic lands. All right, let's look at some actual additions. So Lonecrafter Fawn is really interesting to me. I saw this card. I feel like it's the first time I've seen it, but ETB, discard 1 or more lands, then return that many target non-land permanents from your graveyard to your hand. In land ramp, there is a real problem of flooding. And there's also the problem that every single one of your cards is like a big beater and a threat. If your opponents start wiping the board, countering your spells, destroying your creatures, it's going to get harder and harder for you to bounce back. And especially if you start just finding all the lands in your deck and you're not getting anywhere. And Lonecrafter Fawn is really good because it turns those lands into cards out of your graveyard. I think that is really, really cool, and I think it's worth playing for sure. Another one that's really interesting is Fierce Empath. This is just a card I really like, just a very cheap tutor, very easily grabs any creature 6 mana or greater and puts it into your hand from your deck. I love this. I think it's just a fantastic card, really, really easy inclusion. Another easy inclusion is Tatyova Benthic Druid. Tatyova is probably one of the most popular landfall commanders, and I think if you're playing ramp, you can't not play her, right? She's just so strong. Just putting her in at 5 mana, which is great because Actually, if it triggers Gandalf, I mean, she's legendary, so you only get one. But whenever a land enters the battlefield, draw a card and gain a life. Is really good with all of the ramp you'll get in the late game. It's good to throw her out there and then, you know, just draw an extra card every turn. There's just so much you can do with this card that I think it's just a mistake not to play it. Another 5-mana legendary creature that I find interesting is Thrix, Sudden Storm. Notably, obviously, a flash creature who's a 4/5, but just reducing the cost of our 5-mana spells I think is worthwhile. Even though we're ramping to that number, don't think of it as, oh, I can cast my 5 manas as 4s. Think of it as I can cast 2 spells at 8 instead of 10. Like, that's the goal you're trying to hit. Also, the flash flying creature is just really, really good, and stopping things from being countered is nice. Another big creature that I think is worth playing with Flash is Hullbreaker Horror. Now this is a few bucks, so I don't know if this will break your budget, but definitely a card I really do enjoy. Can't be countered itself, and its 2 abilities are just really strong. If you've ever resolved this creature, you know how powerful this is. And though, you know, there's a lot to say of playing this with a bunch of instants to take advantage of this first ability, there is also something to say about casting this and then just playing it fairly, where you every cast turn after turn, you know, you're just bouncing things back in your opponent's hands, and you're just, you know, getting attacks in, slowing them down. It's just very, very strong, and I think there's no reason not to be playing it, because with that flash, you could almost guarantee the first trigger, right? Another one, and this is one of the types of cards I really like where we have an immediate ETB, is Diluvian Primordial. ETB, cast your opponent's instants and sorceries. I think this is great. Now, I need to see, does Gandalf say from your hand? No. So technically this would work. If you cast 5 mana or greater spells out of your opponent's graveyards, yeah, interesting. That'll trigger Gandalf, and if you can copy that, you'll get extra triggers that way. So this one is very, very interesting. I wonder, there's probably a few others, and I do know there's a few others, but I'm suggesting at least one more, but I think there'd be an interesting thing to look at, especially if you want to work with Gandalf, is spells that allow you to cast more spells, because that trigger is just going to add up every single time, increasing your chance of doubling it, and if you don't double it, you just keep drawing cards. So I do really like that. Now going into some ramp, Our Promise, and I think the other one is, Explore the Underdark. Just notably 5 mana ramp. As stated before, you know, this can be doubled. You know this, we can double this with Gandalf, but what I really like about both these cards is you're just guaranteed the 2 lands, whereas a few of the other ones you have don't guarantee it. Our Promise and Explore the Underdark just say, get 2 basics. I think Our is any land, and Explore is 2 basics, but either way, you guaranteed them. Initiative is real good to get a 3rd land into your hand if you don't have the initiative already, and I think this is just a very, very powerful card. And if you get to copy it, you're in the money, right? Another one that I saw a really good use of the Undaunted mechanic is Seeds of Renewal. So this is another card that's going to return cards from our graveyard back into our hand. But notably, with Undaunted, if all your opponents are in the game, it's actually just 4 mana. But that doesn't change the fact that it's a 7 mana card. And I do really, really like that. And so it'll still trigger Gandalf, and if you get the copy, you're like basically drawing 4, which is phenomenal. And unlike the Fawn, you can pick lands, which is nice, because that is one downside with the Fawn, is the fact that you can't get any lands back. You might run out of cards to grab, whereas Seeds of Renewal doesn't mind. Also, since we're in the colors, I wouldn't mind playing some board clears, right? Oversimplify is a really, really nice one. It just exiles all creatures and gives each player one giant creature. Notably, if you cast this twice, nothing changes, but it is cute if you're able to do so. I don't think you have to. That is the last thing I keep forgetting to read, is if Gandalf says you have to. You do have to. Interesting. Huh. That's kind of weird. Okay. Maybe these cards are a little worse because of that. This one particularly, the other ones not so much. But Oversimplify, alright, maybe you could only cast if you cast it twice, your opponents just draw and you're basically behind. Maybe I don't like this one as much, but I think it's nice to have... Oh no, yeah. Just play it when you don't have Gandalf, I guess I should say. But still, I think it's nice to have a board clear that turns all your opponent's like value creatures into just beaters, which you should be able to deal with. Flood of Tears is another one that's kind of a board clear. Not as good as if you double it, if you're not using an ETB creature, but you should be. Use a Muldrifter, use the Primordial, bounce everything. And as long as you return a creature like 4 more permanents, you get a permanent from your hand onto the battlefield. Now, the other card maybe to use this with would be something like... Because if you copy it, you don't get the ability twice, because you're guaranteed only... Because once you bounce everything, you're going to have only 1 card in play. Once again, I'm not sure if I like this now that I'm thinking about the fact that Gandalf doesn't give you a choice, but I think this spell is just good enough as it is, because it sets you up into situations where if you don't have Gandalf and you cast this, you can throw everything out and then slam one of your big creatures down and get advantage that way, and I really do like that. So be careful when you're using these spells like Oversimplify and Flood of Tears, because I will say there is a point of, this might be kind of bad for you if you use it wrong. On the other hand of board clears, here's one we actually do not mind it casting twice. Azuri's Predation is one of my favorites, honestly, and I think it's a shame it doesn't see as much play as it should. This is both a board clear and an army in a can, especially if you could take advantage of things like boosting your creature's power, or in a deck like this, doubling all of your doubling your spell, right? You cast this twice. Any creature that has more than 4 toughness and less than 4 power, right, will guarantee you have 2 4/4s at the end of the turn. Any creature that has 8 or less toughness is guaranteed to be killed if you double this, right? And then anything in between, is just dies and trades with your token, and you're generally happy with that, right? Especially against opponents who have token strategies, which I think this deck sometimes has a problem with. This will just clean up, give you an army in a can, and set you up really well for your next turn. So I really like this one. I think this is a very strong spell to cast, to go and cast. So here's the other one that casts spells that I wanted to suggest, and that's Spell Twine, where you exile instant or sorcery from your graveyard and instant sorcery from your opponent's graveyard, and you cast them both. And what's really cool, as stated before, is Gandalf will try to double both of those triggers if they are 5 mana or higher, which you should be able to do out of 3 opponents' graveyards, and your own, obviously. So this is really cool. Maybe there's just a build that's just spell like instant and sorcery heavy instead of creature heavy, but I think that makes the deck more expensive and a little more complicated. But still, I think this one is very, very cool. An enchantment that I thought you could be playing, definitely at a budget, is Sandworm Convergence, as this is both a defensive spell and just generates a 5/5 every turn cycle. Now, generally, there's a lot of situations where this isn't that impressive, but on a budget, I think it's a great addition. If you copy it, you're creating 10 power and toughness every turn cycle, which is also really nice. And honestly, shutting off flying completely is just fantastic. It's really weird too, because I always feel like this should be opposite. Like, how are you going to get across this desert on foot when these sandworms are out here? Wouldn't you rather fly over? But apparently, no, these sandworms only attack things in the air. Obviously, the 5/5 stop anything on land, but I think it's a very interesting card. I really do like it. Alright. Clone Legion is probably one of the, I think, the most fun cards you can play in a deck like this, because what you can do with it, so this can be your like big finisher, right? Your big fun finisher, where you target someone, like you target a player who has the best stuff. It can be yourself or anyone, and then you create a huge army. But if you get that copy, right, you get to target. Interesting. Maybe the best thing, because the thing is you have to pick both targets before you have to pick the first target before it resolves. So maybe you cast Clone Legion targeting yourself, then you hope for that copy, target an opponent, get their creatures, and then you copy all of your creatures again, getting a second copy of their creatures. That's, I think, the most fun way to cast this card, but also just being able to double a board, double any board anywhere, and just reap in the benefits of other players' ETBs or all of your own ETBs again. You know, being able to cast your own Primordial again, your Muldrifter again. These are really, really strong cards and abilities that you'll get more than once, and I do really like this. It definitely does feel that this is a card that obviously people don't seem to like as much because it's dependent on what's on the board, but I think this is a lot of fun, especially in lower power where the games tend to stall a lot more. The ability to just rocket ahead by doubling someone's board, I think, is quite a bit of fun. Now, the last two cards, Staff of Titania was something that suggested I looked. This is interesting to me. I think this is better in a landfall deck, but I did want to note this. Something that ramp decks tend not to have is useful equipment that stays useful throughout the game. So like, you know, the only one I think that is usually like that is Sword of Feast and Famine, but that's out of budget for sure. And Sword of Feast and Famine, like, because it untaps a huge amount of lands, you're okay playing it in the late game. But a lot of the other ones, like Sword of Animist or Nissa's Anima, like these, Bitterthorn I think it is, but these cards only like ramp 1 per attack, and after a while they just kind of fall off. And there's this, and there's also, what is it, the Black Blade? What's it called? Is it literally Black Blade? Yeah, Black Blade Report. So this is another one that can be played where it's just giving you bonus for each land you control, which can be thrown onto any creature. But Staff of Titania is like a weird mix of the two, where you gain the bonus but only from your forests, and when it attacks, you get a land creature drop, I should say. And I think this is a really, really interesting mix at this mana cost. I wonder, you know, the other cards that put a land into play every time from your deck, they are much more expensive than this. I wonder if people should be playing this as a budget version of those cards. Yeah, you lose the Dryad to like a board clear, but it still gets you land ramp, and it still gets you that landfall trigger. This is really interesting. I think it's worth playing, but I'll leave it up to you to decide. And the last card, which I think is just kind of boring, is Harmonize, but I wanted to include it anyways. A lot of the spells we have here to draw cards are very dependent on the board or being ahead. So like Return of the Wild Speaker and Rishkar's Expertise are cards that are dependent on having a board. Thunderous Snapper or Gandalf require you to be casting 5-mana spells, and Treasure Cruise, you need to be somewhat ahead, or you need to have enough cards to delve away to make this cheap, right? So all of these cards are good, but none of them are just straight up draw 3, and that's all they do. And I'm a really big fan of that ability. Just Harmonize, just draw 3, don't worry too much about it, don't overthink it, get your 3 cards and just move on. And those are my additions. I like this deck, and I like where it's going. There is a truth to the situation where we are going to be capped by our budget extremely quickly. There's a few reasons for that. One is a lot of good ramp cards and ramp payoffs are universal in green decks, right? They don't just belong in ramp decks. Like in the same way that like Muldrifter is universally good, there's a bunch of like ramp cards that people just love, or creature payoffs that people just love to play no matter the situation. Likewise, you know, there's a bunch of cards like that belong in Kindred decks that are like, all of the Eldrazi are really, really good, but they tend to go into Kindred decks and dedicated Eldrazi decks, and those decks bring in the money. Like, you know, people who play those really like those, so the price of those cards go up, right? On the same point, Landfall and Ramp just by itself is an extremely popular archetype, as it should be. It's incredibly strong, it's incredibly consistent, and it's fun to play. Who doesn't like having like 30 cards on the battlefield? But with that in mind, it means that those cards are just more expensive. So if we are staying in a budget, let's say $2 per card maximum, we can get this deck to be fairly functional but there is a ceiling that we're going to be hitting, right? And the other half of that ceiling is obviously Gandalf himself. Gandalf does have kind of a ceiling on the power level. Gandalf is a support commander for the deck, not the other way around. Like, we're talking about how fun it is to double some of these spells, but there's going to be games where you just don't cast Gandalf. It's just not in the cards. You got better things to do, or you have to present threats to stop opponents. Gandalf is not going to come out. And in those games, Gandalf could have been replaced by any blue-green commander, and it would have been just as well. You know, there's a bunch that will ramp themselves. There's a bunch that will, you know, benefit putting lands into play or landfall. And with that in mind, I just think, like, with our budget, with Gandalf, there is a ceiling on this deck. Now, that's not too bad. I don't think that's a problem. I think it is reasonable for decks to have a ceiling, but we have to just play within them. So if you send this deck again, which I recommend you do, let me know. Let me know exactly what the budget is. Let me know exactly where you want the power level to be, so that we can build this deck in a way that it's going to suit you and suit what you want. And with that in mind, I think that's it. Thank you so much for supporting the channel. Thank you so much for sending your deck. Blue-green ramp is so fun, and I think it's a pretty good start to any deck, any collection. And so if you're a new player and you see this deck, this is a great place to start, and I would recommend it, especially at under $100 for the deck. All right, I've gone on long enough. Good luck. Thank you so much for watching. This video is brought to you by viewers like you and people on my Patreon. If you'd like to send me another draft of this deck, or any deck, there is a link in the video description down below. And if you'd like to make your deck one of my donation decks I work on, there is a link there too. Finally, if you'd like to like, comment, subscribe, I would be very appreciative. It helps the channel quite a bit. Thank you, and good luck in brewing and building.